Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, into a world that feels both familiar and impossibly distant. Imagine a life without electricity, without running water, without supermarkets, or even the smallest convenience store. Tonight's story is all about the peasants of medieval Europe, the men, women, and children who made up nearly 90% of the population. Now, you might think of kings, knights, and castles when you hear the Middle Ages, but the truth is that daily life was mostly shaped by ordinary people working the land, cooking meals over smoky hearths, tending animals, and simply trying to survive one season after another. In this episode, we're going to explore what it would really take for you to live as a peasant back then. What did you eat? How did you sleep? What sort of house sheltered you in the cold winters? And could you, someone from today's world of phones and cars, actually survive their world of mud, fields, and endless labor? So, get comfortable, let your mind drift, and let's start walking into the fields of medieval Europe, where dawn always came too early and work never truly ended. The first thing to understand about medieval peasant life is the rhythm of time itself. You didn't wake up with an alarm clock. You woke up with the sun, or more often, with the sound of a rooster. Sleep was shaped by the seasons. In summer, you might rise as early as 3 or 4 in the morning to begin work, while in winter the darkness gave you a little more rest. Your home was not what we'd call a house today. It was usually a single-room hut, built of wattle and daub, thin branches woven together, covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. The roof was thatched with bundles of reeds. Inside, there was no privacy, no separate bedroom. Your family, and sometimes even your animals, shared the same enclosed space. The warmth of their bodies keeping the room from freezing during harsh winters. The air was thick with smoke because chimneys were rare. Instead, the smoke from your cooking fire would drift up through a hole in the roof, lingering inside and leaving the walls blackened. This smoky haze clung to your hair, your clothing, and your skin. For food, bread was your lifeline. Coarse, heavy loaves made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat bread was for the wealthy, rarely for you. Alongside bread, you might eat pottage, a kind of thick soup or stew, made of whatever vegetables, grains, or beans were available. Meat was a rare treat, often only eaten on festivals, or if you were lucky enough to trap a rabbit in the woods without being caught by the Lord's gamekeepers. And always, in the background, was the land. The fields were everything. From dawn until dusk, your survival depended on plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. Each season brought its own demands, and each mistake could mean hunger in the months ahead. Clothing for a medieval peasant was simple, practical, and made from rough fabrics. Most wore tunics of coarse wool or linen, dyed in dull colors like brown, gray, or faded green. These weren't fashion statements, but protection against the chill and the mud. Shoes, if you had them, were often made of leather and worn until they fell apart. Many children, and even some adults in the summer months, went barefoot to save what little footwear they had. Over your tunic, in colder weather, you might have a cloak fastened with a simple wooden or metal brooch. There were no wardrobes full of options. A peasant might own just 1 or 2 outfits in their lifetime. Washing them wasn't easy either, as soap was expensive. Clothes were scrubbed with ashes, or lie and dried in the sun when weather allowed. Life wasn't just about survival, though. Even in the hardest conditions, people found ways to celebrate and to laugh. Church festivals punctuated the year, Christmas, Easter, and dozens of saints' days. These festivals gave peasants a chance to eat a little better, to drink ale, and to join in music and dancing. Children played games with sticks, balls, and hoops, while adults might gather for wrestling matches or storytelling around a fire. But behind these moments of joy was the ever-present weight of obligation. Peasants didn't truly own the land they worked. It belonged to a lord, and in return for using it, You paid rent, not in coins. Because money was scarce, but often in grain, eggs, or livestock. On top of that came church tithes, usually 1/10 of your harvest, handed over to support the parish and its clergy. This constant pressure meant that even in a good year, your harvest was stretched thin. In a bad year, when rains failed or frost came too early, hunger shadowed the village. Many families lived close to the edge, surviving winter on little more than dried beans, stale bread, and thin broth. And yet, people endured. You can imagine sitting at the wooden table of a peasant household, a small fire flickering, children huddled together for warmth, the scent of pottage bubbling in a pot, and perhaps a faint laugh breaking through the smoke. It wasn't an easy life, but it was their world, woven from small routines of survival and fleeting joys. To really understand peasant life, you have to step into the rhythm of the year. Everything revolved around the seasons, and each brought its own burdens. Spring was a time of frantic activity. The earth had to be plowed and sown with barley, oats, peas, and beans. Oxen were guided slowly across the damp soil, their heavy hooves and wooden plows carving furrows. Men and women bent for hours to scatter seed by hand, often singing work songs to keep the pace steady. Summer brought weeding and haymaking. The days were long, the sun relentless, and the work endless. The meadows had to be cut for hay to feed animals through winter. Scythes rang across the fields, and entire families joined in, even children carrying bundles of grass. Autumn was harvest, the most crucial time of all. Sickles flashed in the fields as grain was cut and tied into sheaves. Villagers worked from sunrise until darkness, because every kernel mattered. This was also when rents and tithes were demanded. Carts loaded with grain would trundle toward the Lord's manor and the parish barn, leaving peasants to calculate anxiously whether enough remained for their own families. Winter was quieter, but not restful. Animals had to be fed and kept alive. Firewood had to be gathered, clothing patched and mended, tools repaired for the next year. Nights were long, with candles or rushlights flickering, and families huddled together around the hearth, sometimes telling old folk tales or reciting prayers. Sleep itself was different from what we know today. Peasants often practiced what historians call segmented sleep. They would go to bed shortly after dusk, sleep for a few hours, then wake in the middle of the night. This waking time might be spent in quiet prayer, mending clothes, or even visiting neighbors by candlelight. After an hour or two, they returned to bed for a second sleep until dawn. Relationships in the village were intimate, but also tense. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Cooperation was essential. You relied on neighbors for help during harvest, or when illness struck, but rivalry simmered too. Gossip spread quickly in such small communities, and disputes over land boundaries or livestock could sour friendships. Family life was both tender and harsh. Children were expected to contribute as soon as they were able, scaring birds from the fields, fetching water, or helping with weaving. Marriages were often practical arrangements, shaped by land and alliances more than by romance. Yet within these constraints, there was still affection. Parents watching children play, couples sharing quiet words at the end of the day, and neighbors coming together to celebrate births, weddings, or even to mourn the passing of one of their own. Despite the hardships, there was a quiet resilience woven through peasant life. Survival demanded not just labor, but also community, patience, and the small comfort of faith that tomorrow's sun would rise again over the fields. While work filled most days, the medieval calendar was also dotted with feast days and holy observances. These weren't simply religious occasions, but also the closest thing peasants had to a holiday. A saint's day might bring respite from labor, a communal meal, or even a fair where merchants set up stalls. Music drifted from bagpipes and fiddles, while villagers danced in circles on the green. For a brief moment, the struggles of survival slipped into the background, replaced by laughter and the taste of ale. Folk beliefs colored everyday life too. While the church was ever present, older traditions lingered. Peasants whispered about charms to protect crops from blight, or carried amulets to ward off illness. Midsummer fires were lit on hilltops to chase away evil spirits, and certain herbs were gathered on specific nights thought to hold magical power. Even dreams were taken seriously, believed to be messages or warnings about the future. Daily routines often revolved around small but necessary chores. Water had to be fetched from the village well or a nearby stream, carried in heavy wooden buckets. Fire had to be kindled each morning, sometimes with nothing more than a spark saved from the night before. Bread had to be baked regularly, though many peasants used communal ovens, where neighbors lined up to cook their loaves one after another. Health was fragile, and remedies were a mix of practical knowledge and superstition. A cut might be cleaned with herbs, or wrapped in linen soaked in wine, if one could afford it. Fever might be treated with mixtures of garlic, honey, or vinegar. More mysterious ailments were blamed on humors, curses, or divine punishment. Illness could sweep through a village without warning, and with little understanding of disease, people relied on prayer and patience as much as any treatment. In the evenings, after work and chores, there was a quieter rhythm. Villagers gathered in small groups, sometimes in one another's homes, to share stories, sing songs, or listen to a traveling minstrel, if one happened to pass through. Children drifted to sleep on straw mattresses stuffed with reeds, while parents stretched sore muscles and stared into the fire, measuring the balance of another day survived. Though harsh, this life was not without beauty. The sight of dawn mist rising over fields, the smell of fresh bread, the joy of a child's laughter, or the comfort of hearing church bells ring across the valley. These were the small moments that stitched together the existence of a medieval peasant. Tools were the backbone of peasant survival, yet they were often crude and handmade. A wooden plow tipped with iron scythes for cutting hay, sickles for harvesting grain, wooden rakes, and simple hoes for breaking the soil. These tools weren't luxuries. They were shared, repaired, and passed down across generations. When iron edges dulled, a local blacksmith might sharpen them, though many households made do with what they had. Each tool carried the marks of calloused hands, a quiet witness 2 years of toil. Gender roles shaped every part of life. Men typically handled the heavy fieldwork, plowing, sowing, and harvesting, but women's labor was just as relentless. They tended kitchen gardens, kept chickens, milked goats or cows, spun wool, wove cloth, and brewed ale. Women also managed the household, cooking meals and caring for children, all while contributing to the agricultural work when needed. Children were folded into this structure early on, not as bystanders, but as small helpers whose efforts kept the family afloat. Within peasant society itself, there were subtle layers. Not all peasants were equal. Some were free tenants, renting land with more independence, while others were serfs, bound to the lord's estate, unable to leave without permission. Even within a village, there was quiet pride or shame in these distinctions. A family with a slightly larger plot of land, or a few more animals, might hold greater respect, while those with little depended on seasonal labor for others to survive. Leisure, though scarce, existed in surprising ways. Games with dice or carved wooden pieces were popular among men, while storytelling and ballads filled long evenings. Wrestling, archery, and even simple foot races became village entertainments. During fairs, jugglers and entertainers performed tricks, capturing the imaginations of children. These diversions, however brief, gave balance to the endless rhythm of labor. Another often overlooked detail was the soundscape of peasant life. The clatter of wooden carts on dirt roads, the rhythmic creak of a water mill, the bleating of sheep, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer all blended into a daily backdrop. At night, the village grew quieter, but dogs barked, owls hooted, and the distant tolling of a church bell sometimes cut through the stillness. These textures of work, sound, and small diversions painted a fuller picture of survival. Peasants were not merely nameless workers, but individuals with identities, emotions, and fleeting joys, living lives that, though harsh, were deeply human. Survival in medieval Europe depended not just on growing food, but on keeping it edible through the long winters. Preservation methods were simple, but vital. Grains were stored in wooden bins or clay jars, carefully sealed to keep out mice and damp. Meat, when available, was salted, smoked, or dried in the open air. Fish from rivers or coastal waters was often pickled in brine. Vegetables like beans, peas, and onions were strung up or dried, while root crops, such as turnips and carrots, were buried in cool cellars or pits lined with straw. Without these methods, hunger could quickly turn into famine when the fields lay barren under snow. Childbirth was both a miracle and a danger. Most women gave birth at home, surrounded by female relatives and a village midwife. There were no hospitals, and doctors were a distant luxury. Herbs like fennel or rue might be used to ease labor, but complications often proved fatal for mother or child. Still, children were cherished, for they meant more helping hands in the fields and the hope of care in old age. Large families were common, though survival rates were uncertain, with many infants lost to illness in their earliest years. Weather was a constant companion, both generous and cruel. Too much rain could rot the crops in the ground, while too little brought drought and withered fields. Harsh winters froze rivers and killed livestock. A single storm at the wrong moment might destroy a year's work. Peasants measured their lives by these forces, watching the skies with anxious eyes, hoping for balance. When natural disasters struck, floods, hailstorms, or even swarms of locusts, they often turned to faith to explain what could not be controlled. The church stood at the heart of every village, its steeple often the tallest structure for miles. Bells marked the hours of prayer, and the calendar of worship shaped daily life as much as the turning seasons. Sunday was for rest and mass, though rest still meant feeding animals and baking bread. Priests recorded baptisms, marriages, and deaths, binding each life into the rhythm of the parish. For many peasants, the church was more than a place of worship. It was a source of guidance, comfort, and the promise that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. But the church also meant obligation. Tithes 1/10 of produce were expected, even in lean years. Sermons reminded peasants of obedience, both to God and to their earthly lords. Yet in moments of despair, when crops failed or sickness spread, the church was often where villagers gathered, kneeling together, candles flickering in the dark, seeking hope in words older than their struggles. This balance of labor, faith, and resilience defined the peasant's world. Survival wasn't just about enduring hunger or weather, but about weaving meaning into hardship, finding strength in rituals, and believing that life, however harsh, carried purpose. Justice in a medieval village was local, immediate, and often public. Most disputes were handled in the manor court, overseen by the lord or his steward. Here, peasants gathered to hear judgments on quarrels over land boundaries, stolen livestock, or broken agreements. Punishments varied. Fines paid in grain or animals were common, but for theft, public humiliation might be imposed. A thief could be placed in the stocks, hands and head locked in wooden frames, left for hours while neighbors jeered or threw scraps. Harsher crimes, like violence or repeated theft, could result in whipping or, in rare cases, expulsion from the village, a fate nearly as grim as death, since survival alone was almost impossible. Travel was rare for peasants, yet it was not unheard of. Most people spent their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace. But fairs and markets offered a chance to see beyond familiar fields. Once or twice a year, villagers might walk to a nearby town where merchants sold salt, cloth, iron tools, or pottery. Such gatherings buzzed with energy. Jugglers entertained, traders haggled, and news of distant places spread by word of mouth. Outsiders were viewed with curiosity and suspicion in equal measure. A wandering minstrel or peddler might be welcomed for their stories and goods, while a stranger without purpose could raise fears of theft or mischief. Pilgrims on their way to holy sites often passed through villages, their presence a reminder of the larger world beyond. Sometimes, mercenaries or tax collectors arrived, their visits leaving behind unease and a sense of vulnerability. Trade, though limited, tied peasants into a wider network. Surplus eggs, wool, or honey might be bartered for items a household couldn't produce on its own. In this way, even the most remote village was connected, however faintly, to towns and markets miles away. Despite these interactions, the village remained its own world. News of wars, kings, or distant events mattered little compared to the yield of the harvest or the temper of the weather. For the peasant, survival was measured in days of work completed and food stored for winter, not in the rise or fall of kingdoms. Yet every so often, an encounter with an outsider, a monk bringing manuscripts, a soldier boasting of battles, or a merchant with exotic cloth, stirred imagination. Perhaps it left a child dreaming of lands beyond the fields, though few ever left the boundaries of their home. For most medieval peasants, formal education was out of reach. Schools were rare, and literacy was often limited to priests, monks, and a handful of wealthier townsfolk. In the villages, knowledge passed not through books, but through memory and speech. Children learned by watching their parents how to sow seeds, how to spin wool, how to tend animals. Skills were not written down. They were lived, practiced, and repeated until they became second nature. Still, words held power. In the evenings, when the day's labor was finally done, peasants gathered to share stories. Some tales were practical lessons about farming, warnings about weather, advice wrapped in simple anecdotes. Others were old legends, handed down across generations, stories of saints who had protected villages, of miraculous healings, or even remnants of older, pagan myths that lingered quietly under the surface of Christian teachings. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of giants, fairies, or battles fought long ago. These stories were not just entertainment, but the village's library, its collective memory. They carried history, morality, and wonder all in one. For many, these oral traditions were the only doorway into a wider world of imagination. Personal hygiene was a more complicated matter. Baths as we know them were rare luxuries. Instead, peasants washed their hands, faces, and feet when possible, often using water from streams or wells. A full body wash might happen only a few times a year, especially in colder regions, where heating large amounts of water was difficult. However, cleanliness was not entirely absent. People scrubbed with rough cloths, used ashes or sand as mild abrasives, and combed their hair to keep lice at bay. Communal baths did exist in some towns, but villagers usually made do with more modest habits. Clothing absorbed much of daily grime, and when it grew too soiled, it was beaten, rinsed, and dried in the sun. The smoky air of huts and the constant contact with animals added to the smells of daily life. But peasants grew accustomed to it, scarcely noticing what might overwhelm someone from our time. Festivals offered rare chances to break from this grind. Beyond the great religious feasts like Christmas or Easter, there were seasonal celebrations tied to farming cycles. Harvest time brought Thanksgiving feasts, with ale flowing more freely and music echoing across the village green. May Day welcomed spring with dancing around poles decorated with flowers and ribbons. Midsummer fires burned brightly, both as Christian rituals and as echoes of older traditions, drawing villagers together under the long twilight sky. During these gatherings, a sense of community deepened. Food was shared, songs were sung, and even the poorest could feel part of something larger than themselves. Young people met and flirted under the watchful eyes of elders. Friendships were renewed, and weary spirits found brief renewal. As for the future, peasants rarely thought in terms of grand ambitions. Dreams were practical: a good harvest, a healthy child, a mild winter. Some hoped to save enough to rent a larger strip of land, or perhaps to send a child into service in a town, where opportunities, though modest, might be broader. A few clung to more distant hopes, like joining a pilgrimage to a holy site, an adventure that offered spiritual reward and the chance to see new places. But mostly, the horizon of a peasant's life was defined by the village, the church tower, and the fields. The world beyond existed, but for many, it remained as distant as the stars they glimpsed on clear nights after long days of labor. For most medieval peasants, formal education was out of reach. Schools were rare, and literacy was often limited to priests, monks, and a handful of wealthier townsfolk. In the villages, knowledge passed not through books, but through memory and speech. Children learned by watching their parents how to sow seeds, how to spin wool, how to tend animals. Skills were not written down. They were lived, practiced, and repeated until they became second nature. Still, words held power. In the evenings, when the day's labor was finally done, peasants gathered to share stories. Some tales were practical lessons about farming, warnings about weather, advice wrapped in simple anecdotes. Others were old legends, handed down across generations. Stories of saints who had protected villages, of miraculous healings, or even remnants of older, pagan myths that lingered quietly under the surface of Christian teachings. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of giants, fairies, or battles fought long ago. These stories were not just entertainment, but the village's library, its collective memory. They carried history, morality, and wonder all in one. For many, these oral traditions were the only doorway into a wider world of imagination. Personal hygiene was a more complicated matter. Baths as we know them were rare luxuries. Instead, peasants washed their hands, faces, and feet when possible, often using water from streams or wells. A full body wash might happen only a few times a year, especially in colder regions, where heating large amounts of water was difficult. However, cleanliness was not entirely absent. People scrubbed with rough cloths, used ashes or sand as mild abrasives, and combed their hair to keep lice at bay. Communal baths did exist in some towns, but villagers usually made do with more modest habits. Clothing absorbed much of daily grime, and when it grew too soiled, it was beaten, rinsed, and dried in the sun. The smoky air of huts and the constant contact with animals added to the smells of daily life. But peasants grew accustomed to it, scarcely noticing what might overwhelm someone from our time. Festivals offered rare chances to break from this grind. Beyond the great religious feasts like Christmas or Easter, there were seasonal celebrations tied to farming cycles. Harvest time brought Thanksgiving feasts, with ale flowing more freely and music echoing across the village green. May Day welcomed spring with dancing around poles decorated with flowers and ribbons. Midsummer fires burned brightly, both as Christian rituals and as echoes of older traditions, drawing villagers together under the long twilight sky. During these gatherings, a sense of community deepened. Food was shared, songs were sung, and even the poorest could feel part of something larger than themselves. Young people met and flirted under the watchful eyes of elders. Friendships were renewed, and weary spirits found brief renewal. As for the future, peasants rarely thought in terms of grand ambitions. Dreams were practical: a good harvest, a healthy child, a mild winter. Some hoped to save enough to rent a larger strip of land, or perhaps to send a child into service in a town, where opportunities, though modest, might be broader. A few clung to more distant hopes, like joining a pilgrimage to a holy site, an adventure that offered spiritual reward and the chance to see new places. But mostly, the horizon of a peasant's life was defined by the village, the church tower, and the fields. The world beyond existed, but for many, It remained as distant as the stars they glimpsed on clear nights after long days of labor. Life inside a medieval peasant's home was a mixture of cooperation, duty, and survival. The family was the fundamental unit of society, and every member, whether man, woman, or child, had responsibilities that contributed to keeping the household running. The role of the husband was generally centered on heavy labor and obligations outside the home. He was expected to work long hours in the fields, care for livestock, and perform any services demanded by the local lord. His strength was his greatest asset, and from dawn until dusk he toiled to ensure the family had enough food for the coming months. The role of the wife, however, was equally important, though often less recognized. A peasant woman not only helped with agricultural labor, sowing seeds, weeding, harvesting, but also maintained the household itself. She cooked meals over the hearth, baked bread in clay ovens, spun wool into thread, and mended clothes. She often kept a small garden near the cottage where she grew herbs and vegetables, ensuring the family had some variety in their diet. Women also tended to chickens or goats, providing eggs, milk, and occasional meat for the family. Children were not exempt from this web of responsibility. From an early age, they were expected to contribute according to their abilities. A young boy might help his father herd animals or gather firewood, while a girl would assist her mother in fetching water, preparing food, or watching over younger siblings. Childhood, as we think of it today, a period of play and schooling, was a luxury peasants could not afford. For them, childhood blended seamlessly into work and duty. Still, play was not absent. Children in medieval villages played simple games with stones, wooden dolls, or sticks. Festivals and feast days also gave them moments of joy. Songs, rhymes, and folk tales were passed down orally, teaching them lessons about morality, religion, and survival in a world where literacy was rare. Another critical aspect of family life was marriage. Peasant marriages were often arranged, not for romance, but for survival and practicality. Families considered land, alliances, and labor potential. A daughter marrying into another household meant strengthening ties between families, while a son taking a wife brought an extra pair of working hands into the cottage. Weddings were modest affairs, but marked with music, dance, and communal feasting, a much-needed break from daily hardship. Life inside the peasant home was not easy. The cottage was dark, smoky, and cramped. Privacy barely existed. Families often slept together in one or two beds, stuffed with straw, covered in rough wool blankets. Domestic animals sometimes shared the same space, particularly during winter months when warmth was precious. Despite these hardships, the peasant family structure provided a strong sense of unity. Each member's role was clear, and survival depended on their collective effort. For peasants, food was the center of survival, and yet it was often plain, repetitive, and limited by what the land could provide. Unlike the nobility who could afford spices, fine breads, and meat, peasants relied on simple staples, and most meals were shaped by the rhythm of the agricultural year. Bread and porridge were the foundation of the peasant diet. Bread was usually coarse and dark, made from rye, barley, or oats, since fine white wheat bread was reserved for wealthier classes. In times of scarcity, peasants might even mix acorns or ground beans into flour, creating a dense, bitter loaf that filled the stomach but offered little nutrition. Porridge, a thick mixture of grains, boiled in water or milk, was eaten daily, sometimes flavored with leeks, onions, or wild herbs. Vegetables played an important role, though the variety was limited. Cabbage, leeks, onions, and turnips were staples, easy to grow and capable of lasting through colder months. In summer and autumn, peasants might enjoy beans, peas, or fresh greens from their gardens. Herbs like parsley, dill, and sage were common seasonings, while garlic was valued for both flavor and medicinal qualities. Meat was rare. Most peasants only tasted pork, mutton, or beef during festivals, weddings, or feast days. Chickens provided eggs, but even they were too valuable to slaughter regularly. Hunting was often forbidden to peasants by strict laws protecting the lord's game, so wild animals were not a reliable food source. Fish, however, was more accessible in some regions, especially near rivers or coasts. Salted or dried fish often supplemented the diet during Lent or other church-imposed fasting days when meat was forbidden. Dairy products such as cheese, butter, and milk were essential, particularly from goats and cows. Cheese could be stored longer and transported easily, making it a key food for peasants. In lean times, even soured milk or whey became a meal. The church calendar had a direct influence on peasant meals. Fasting days, sometimes nearly half the year, restricted meat consumption. On such days, peasants turned to fish, grains, vegetables, and bread. These religious rules reinforced the already simple diet and added to the monotony of meals. Drink was equally important. Ale was the common beverage, brewed in homes or small village ale, since water was not always safe to drink. Weak ale with low alcohol content became the everyday drink for both adults and children. Stronger ales were saved for special occasions. In wine-growing regions, peasants might have access to cheap, sour wine, though it was far less common than ale. Seasons determined everything. In summer, fresh produce could be eaten daily, while autumn brought the harvest, the most crucial moment of the year. Winter was the hardest time. Families relied on salted, dried, or stored foods, carefully rationing supplies until spring. A harsh winter or a failed harvest could mean hunger, malnutrition, or even famine. Food, then, was not only sustenance but also a reflection of the peasant's vulnerability to nature. Every meal was tied to the success of the fields, the rhythm of the seasons, and the mercy of weather that could destroy months of hard labor. Health for a medieval peasant was fragile at best. With limited knowledge of medicine, scarce resources, and constant exposure to hard labor, disease and injury were constant threats. Life expectancy was short. Many peasants only lived into their 30s or 40s, though those who survived childhood could sometimes reach their 50s or beyond. Illnesses were common and could be devastating. Malnutrition made peasants vulnerable to fevers, infections, and epidemics. Simple ailments that might be curable today, like toothaches, broken bones, or infected cuts, could easily turn fatal. Seasonal diseases like dysentery or influenza often swept through villages, while larger outbreaks, such as the plague, left entire communities devastated. Peasants had little access to trained physicians, who were expensive and usually served nobles or townsfolk. Instead, most relied on folk remedies, herbal medicine, and local healers. Women often carried knowledge of herbs passed down through generations. For example, garlic was used to treat coughs and infections. Chamomile helped with stomach pains and sleeplessness. Willow bark, containing natural salicin, was chewed for pain relief. These remedies were not always effective, but they were the only accessible form of care. Wounds were treated with poultices made of herbs, honey, or animal fat. Sometimes, however, treatments caused more harm than good. Dirty bandages or crude surgical tools often led to deadly infections. Broken bones might be set with splints, but recovery was slow and uncertain. The church also played a role in medicine. Monks and nuns in monasteries often cultivated herb gardens and copied medical texts. Some monasteries offered care to peasants, but these were rare and usually located far from rural villages. For most peasants, faith and prayer were as important as herbs. Illness was often seen as punishment for sin, and confession, fasting, or pilgrimages might be prescribed alongside physical remedies. Hygiene was another major factor in health. Peasants did not have access to clean water or proper sanitation. Human and animal waste was often close to living spaces, spreading disease quickly. Bathing was infrequent, not only because of lack of resources, but also because some believed excessive washing weakened the body. Instead, peasants sometimes rubbed themselves with cloths or herbs to reduce odors. Dental health was poor. Without sugar, peasants had fewer cavities than later generations. But coarse bread ground, with stone left behind grit that wore down teeth. Many peasants lived with constant dental pain, loose teeth, or infections. Childbirth was one of the greatest dangers for women. With no trained doctors, midwives managed deliveries using traditional practices. Complications were frequent, and mortality rates for both mothers and infants were high. Still, children were essential for the family's survival, and large families were common despite the risks. In times of plague or widespread disease, peasants were often powerless. Whole villages might be abandoned or destroyed, leaving survivors to wonder if divine punishment or evil spirits were to blame. These events reinforced the deep reliance on religion and community in the face of suffering. By now, we've seen how the life of a medieval peasant was shaped by constant cycles of labor, obligation, and survival. From the smoky cottages where families huddled together for warmth, to the endless fields where dawn-to-dusk labor defined the rhythm of each day. The world of the peasant was both humble and unrelenting. Their lives were governed by the land and the seasons, their meals shaped by what the earth could provide, and their faith interwoven into every hardship and celebration. Illness was ever present, and yet communities clung to the strength of family bonds, traditions, and the rituals of the church to carry them through. Life was not easy, but it was purposeful. Every task, no matter how small, contributed to the survival of the household and the village. In many ways, peasants were the backbone of medieval Europe, though their stories often went unrecorded in the grand chronicles of kings and nobles. Their existence may have been simple, but it was rich with resilience, routine, and deep ties to the soil. We will move beyond the walls of the peasant cottage and out into the manor fields, the village green, and the shadow of the Lord's castle. We'll explore how peasants were bound by law and custom, what freedoms they lacked, and what obligations they carried. And just as importantly, we'll consider the small spaces where they carved out resilience and resistance within a system that was often harsh and unyielding. To understand the life of a peasant in medieval Europe, we must place them within the larger framework of the feudal system, the political, social, and economic structure that dominated the Middle Ages. Peasants were the lowest rung in this hierarchy, yet they were the majority who kept the system alive. At the very top stood the king, who, in theory, owned all the land of the realm. Beneath him were the nobles and lords, who held large estates in exchange for loyalty and military support. Below them were the knights, who served as the armed protectors of the realm. At the base of this pyramid were the peasants and serfs, who worked the land and produced the food that sustained everyone above them. This arrangement was not simply about farming. It was a system of mutual obligations, at least in theory. A lord granted peasants the right to live on his land and farm small plots for their own survival. In return, peasants owed him labor, a share of their crops, and loyalty. The lord was supposed to offer protection from outside threats, whether from bandits, rival lords, or invading armies. But for the peasant, this bargain was deeply unequal. While the lord lived in relative comfort within the manor or castle, peasants lived under constant demands. Their survival hinged not only on the success of their crops, but also on the obligations imposed by their feudal superiors. There were, however, distinctions among peasants themselves. Free peasants rented land from their lord, paying rent in crops, money, or labor. Though they were still bound by obligations, they retained some legal rights, such as the ability to move to another manor if they wished. Serfs, on the other hand, were tied permanently to the land. They could not leave without the lord's permission, and their children inherited the same status. Serfdom was not slavery, but it limited freedom in profound ways. A serf could marry, but often only with the lord's approval. He could own small possessions, but much of what he produced belonged to the manor. The lord's control extended into many corners of a peasant's life. He could demand labor on his own fields. This was known as domain work. A serf might spend several days each week plowing, sowing, or harvesting the lord's crops before turning to his own tiny strip of land. In addition, peasants were often required to perform other tasks, repairing roads, maintaining fences, hauling timber, or even helping with construction on the lord's estate. The manor itself functioned as a self-contained world. It included the lord's lands, the peasants' fields, the village, a church, and often mills or ovens. Peasants did not always own these tools of survival outright. Instead, they had to pay the lord fees to use the mill to grind grain, or the oven to bake bread. These dues could feel burdensome, but without them, peasants had no means of preparing their food. Justice, too, was controlled by the lord. Disputes between peasants, whether over land boundaries, theft, or family matters, were judged in the manorial court. Here the lord, or his appointed steward, presided, and punishments could range from fines to loss of property. In this way, law was less about universal fairness and more about maintaining the lord's authority over his dependents. To the modern eye, this system might seem suffocating, but for the peasant, it was simply the structure of life. Bound to the soil, answerable to the manor, peasants carried on with resilience because they had little choice. The lord was their master, but he was also their shield in times of trouble. When raids or wars swept across the land, it was often the lord's fortress that stood between the peasant and destruction. The manor was the backbone of medieval rural society. It was both an economic unit and a way of life, a place where peasants, serfs, and their lord's household were bound together in a web of labor, duty, and necessity. Most peasants never traveled more than a few miles from their home, so the manor was their world. Fields, meadows, woodland, village, and lord's estate all rolled into one. A typical manor included several distinct parts. The domain lands, fields worked directly for the lord, where peasants were obligated to spend a portion of their week. The peasant strips, narrow plots assigned to families, often scattered across different fields, rather than grouped together. This scattering ensured fairness, since no one family bore all the risk of bad soil or poor drainage. Common land, meadows and pastures where peasants grazed their animals collectively. Woodlands and rivers, sources of fuel, game, and fish. Though access was often tightly regulated by the lord, the village itself was the beating heart of this system. Rows of simple cottages lined dirt paths, often clustered around the church or manor house. Beyond the village stretched the open field system, vast tracts of farmland divided into long strips without fences or hedges. Each family farmed several strips scattered across the fields, ensuring no one household monopolized fertile ground. Peasants owed a wide range of duties and dues to the lord. These might include labor service, working on the lord's domain lands for a set number of days each week, rents, paid in grain, livestock, or sometimes coins, depending on the arrangement, feudal dues, special payments when the lord's daughter married, his son was knighted, or if the lord was captured in war and required ransom, fees for services. Peasants often had to pay to use the manor's mill, winepress, or communal oven. For a peasant family, these obligations could be crushing. Imagine finishing your own long day's work, only to be summoned to repair the manor's road, gather wood for the lord's hall, or assist in harvesting the domain crops. Yet these duties were not optional. They were woven into the very structure of society. The manorial court reinforced this order, held in the manor's hall, or sometimes outdoors, beneath a large tree. It was the place where disputes were settled, rules enforced, and peasants reminded of their obligations. A peasant accused of letting his animals stray into another's field might face a fine. One who failed to show up for labor service might lose his land rights. The court was less about justice in the modern sense and more about maintaining order within the community. Yet, despite these heavy burdens, village life also carried its own rhythms of cooperation. Neighbors often worked side by side in the fields, shared tools, and lent each other animals for plowing. During harvest time, the entire village might join together, working communally to bring in the crops before the weather turned. When danger threatened, such as a raid or famine, villagers supported one another as best they could. The manor was not only an economic system, but also a cultural one. Festivals, feast days, and religious observances gave villagers moments of relief and joy, breaking the monotony of toil. The ringing of the church bell structured their days, reminding them not only of prayers but of their place in the great chain of feudal society. Life under the Lord's authority was never easy, but it was the framework within which peasants made meaning, sustained families, and nurtured communities. For all its restrictions, the manor gave peasants a sense of belonging, however humble, in a world that was vast and often hostile. Peasants were not merely bound by the rhythm of the fields but also by laws that governed their personal lives. For those classed as serfs, freedom of movement was restricted. They could not leave the manor without the Lord's permission. If a serf wished to marry someone from another manor, the Lord had to approve the match, often demanding a fee for the privilege. Even within the village, marriages could be subject to manorial consent, since lords were reluctant to lose laborers through unions that might take families elsewhere. Inheritance was another domain where the Lord's authority pressed down heavily. When a peasant died, the family could not simply pass their land to the next generation without acknowledgement. A heriot, a kind of inheritance payment, often in the form of the deceased's best ox, horse, or tool, was owed to the lord before the land could transfer. For poor families, losing their most valuable possession at such a moment could be devastating. Beyond obligations, there were countless small restrictions that reminded peasants of their dependent status. They might be required to grind grain only at the Lord's mill, bake bread only in the manor oven, or press grapes only in the manor winepress. Each use came with a fee. Fishing in a river or hunting in nearby woods could be punished as poaching, for those rights belonged solely to the Lord. Even gathering fallen branches for firewood might be restricted, forcing families to petition for permission to collect fuel in winter. Despite this, peasants were not entirely powerless. Within the confines of the system, they found ways to negotiate or resist. Sometimes they delayed their labor obligations, offered small bribes to stewards, or quietly took advantage of the Lord's absence to graze animals or gather wood on forbidden lands. While open rebellion was rare and dangerous, everyday resistance, minor evasions, bending of rules, and quiet non-compliance formed a subtle undercurrent in peasant life. There were also moments when communities stood together. Villagers might petition the Lord as a group for reduced dues after a poor harvest or band together to defend customary rights. On occasion, collective refusal to perform labor forced concessions, though such acts risked harsh penalties. In this way, the relationship between lord and peasant was not only one of domination, but also of negotiation, a fragile balance of power. Religious teaching reinforced acceptance of this order. The church preached that life on earth was a divinely ordained hierarchy, kings above nobles, nobles above peasants, with God presiding over all. Serfs were told that patience, humility, and obedience would earn them a reward in heaven, even if their lives on earth were full of hardship. Priests echoed this message in sermons, linking labor in the fields to service of God, reminding peasants that their toil mirrored the biblical call to earn bread by the sweat of the brow. And yet, the church was also a source of protection. Many manorial disputes were arbitrated with reference to Christian morality. Priests might intercede for villagers, especially when obligations threatened survival. Festivals tied to the liturgical calendar brought color and relief into the drudgery of life. Saints' days, Easter, and Christmas, transformed the village into a space of shared celebration, offering peasants moments to reclaim joy and solidarity. For most peasants, the hope of improving one's condition was slim, yet not impossible. If a serf managed to escape and live in a town for a year and a day without being caught, he or she could sometimes claim freedom. Towns, with their markets and guilds, offered opportunities unknown in the countryside, but flight was risky, and most remained tied to the soil, generation after generation, bound by custom and law to their lord. The life of a medieval peasant was measured less by the ticking of hours on a clock and more by the changing of the seasons. Each month carried its own tasks and demands, and survival depended on responding to the earth's rhythm. In spring, plowing and sowing were at the forefront. Oxen dragged heavy wooden plows through the soil, and peasants scattered seeds by hand, covering them with hair. The air smelled of damp earth, and there was both hope and anxiety in the work. A poor planting season meant hunger months later. Summer brought long days of tending crops, weeding, and guarding fields from animals or thieves. Autumn was the most crucial, for it meant harvest. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats were gathered, stored, and portioned carefully. Winter, in contrast, was quieter but no less dangerous. Food supplies dwindled, sickness spread easily in the cold, and animals had to be kept alive despite scarce fodder. Meals reflected this cycle. Bread was the staple, made from coarse grains, often mixed with rye or oats when wheat was too expensive. The bread was dense, sometimes sour, and eaten with pottage, a thick stew of beans, peas, cabbage, or leeks, flavored when possible, with scraps of pork, fat, or a bone. Meat was rare for peasants, though salted pork or smoked fish might appear on special occasions. Cheese, curds, and ale brewed at home filled out the diet. In hard years, people resorted to acorns, chestnuts, or bread made from ground-up beans and weeds. Malnutrition was never far away. Clothing was simple and practical. Men wore tunics of coarse wool or linen, belted at the waist, with hose or simple leggings. Women dressed in long woolen gowns with aprons, their hair covered by veils or wimples. Shoes, if owned at all, were made of rough leather, and many peasants went barefoot in warmer months. Bright colors and fine fabrics, silk, velvet, dyed cloth, were reserved for the wealthy, while peasants lived in shades of brown, gray, and dull green, the hues of undyed wool and earth. Homes were modest, usually single-room huts made of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. A central hearth provided heat, and smoke curled upward through a hole in the roof, darkening the timbers. Families, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, often shared the space with chickens or pigs, especially in winter. Privacy was unknown, and life was communal by necessity. Straw-stuffed mattresses, rough blankets, and benches doubled as beds. The flicker of rushlights, or a single candle, illuminated the interior. Despite the hardship, family and community ties provided a sense of security. Children began helping in the fields as soon as they were able. Boys learned plowing and animal care, while girls helped with spinning, cooking, and tending gardens. Play was not absent. Games with wooden toys, rough ball play, and singing accompanied childhood, but work was always close at hand. Marriages were often arranged with practical concerns in mind, strengthening ties between households and ensuring survival. Religion, once again, shaped the year. The church calendar marked time through feasts and fasts. Lent restricted diet, Advent prepared for Christmas, and saints' days punctuated the monotony of labor with moments of celebration. Fairs and festivals were eagerly awaited, bringing markets, dancing, music, and ale, a brief suspension of toil where laughter and storytelling bound the community together. Illness was an ever-present threat. Without modern medicine, peasants relied on herbal remedies, charms, and prayers. A fever might be treated with willow bark, a cough with honey, and wounds with poultices of herbs. Yet epidemics, dysentery, smallpox, or, in the later Middle Ages, the Black Death could devastate entire villages. Life expectancy was short, often under 40 years, though those who survived childhood could live longer. The social fabric of the village was tight-knit. Disputes over land, water rights, or inheritance could cause friction, but cooperation was vital. Shared plowing, collective harvesting, and communal grazing rights meant that survival depended on mutual trust. Gossip traveled quickly, and reputations mattered greatly. Honesty, reliability, and piety were prized virtues, for they secured one's place within the group. All of this paints a picture of resilience. Peasants lived lives of constraint and hardship, yet within that framework, they built families, preserved traditions, and carved out spaces of joy. Their existence was not only drudgery, but also ritual, celebration, and shared endurance. While most peasants lived their entire lives within the boundaries of their village and manor, the pull of nearby towns was undeniable. On market days, peasants might travel miles along rutted dirt tracks, leading carts filled with grain, eggs, cheese, or surplus vegetables. For many, it was the only time they left the familiar fields, and the bustle of a market town could feel both exhilarating and intimidating. The sights were overwhelming: stalls piled with goods, vendors shouting prices, tinkers and smiths hammering at wares, the mingled smells of spiced meat, fresh bread, tallow smoke, and animals. Merchants displayed bright cloth from Flanders, fine wine from France, or salt from distant coasts. For a peasant, such luxuries were mostly out of reach, yet the exposure widened horizons. Even if they could not afford a bolt of dyed wool or a copper kettle, peasants returned home with new ideas and stories of distant places. Markets also offered opportunities to sell produce and crafts. A peasant's wife might trade spun yarn or surplus butter, while her husband negotiated for iron tools or shoes for the oxen. Barter was common, though coinage circulated increasingly as towns grew. Some peasants saved small amounts of money, hoping one day to purchase their own freedom or secure better land. Towns also presented danger. Pickpockets mingled in the crowds, and disease spread quickly in cramped, unsanitary streets. The church warned peasants about the temptations of urban life: drinking, gambling, or excessive spending. Yet despite the risks, markets provided a lifeline, linking rural villages to the wider economy of medieval Europe. This growing exchange between village and town gradually shifted the balance of power. Lords depended on markets to sell their surplus and to buy goods not produced locally, while peasants gained a measure of independence by dealing directly with merchants. Over time, this gave rise to a new class of people, neither lord nor serf, who made their living through trade and craft. These changes, though subtle at first, began to chip away at the rigid structures of feudalism. For peasants themselves, the prospect of town life held both hope and fear. Towns sometimes offered charters of freedom. If a runaway serf managed to live there for a year and a day without being reclaimed, he or she could become legally free. Such stories spread like whispers through villages, filling some with dreams of escape. Yet, abandoning the manor also meant losing the protection of lord and community, venturing into a world where survival depended solely on one's wits. The relationship between village and manor remained strong, however. Lords often required peasants to pay taxes in kind: grain, wool, or chickens, which might be sold at market. In this way, the peasants' labor sustained not just their own households, but also the wealth of their lord and the prosperity of nearby towns. The rise of guilds within towns, associations of craftsmen like weavers, bakers, or blacksmiths, added another layer of complexity. Guild members often protected their trades fiercely, making it difficult for peasants to compete. Still, the existence of organized crafts and markets showed peasants a glimpse of a world beyond endless plowing and sowing, a world where skill, rather than birth, might determine one's future. This dynamic between land, market, and power illustrates how peasants were both bound and yet connected, rooted in their soil, but linked by roads, rivers, and trade routes to a larger medieval world. Even the humblest farmer had a place, however small, in the vast network of economic and social exchange. For all their labor in the fields and homes, peasants carried an invisible burden that weighed as heavily as their plows, the constant demands of rents, dues, and taxes. These obligations were not optional. They were the very foundation of feudal society. A peasant who lived on a lord's manor was rarely the outright owner of his land. Instead, he held it in exchange for service. This could mean a fixed number of days working the lord's fields each year, a portion of his harvest handed over at threshing time, or payments in coin where money was available. These rents were varied and often complex, shaped by centuries of custom. Some dues were tied to life's milestones. When a peasant married, he might owe the lord a merchet, a fee for the right to wed. If he inherited land, a harriet might be demanded, often paid with the best animal in his possession. Even death brought obligations. When a serf died, his lord might claim the family's most valuable cow, horse, or ox before the inheritance passed to heirs. The church, too, levied its share. The tithe, typically 1/10 of a peasant's produce, was due to the parish priest. This could mean a bundle of grain, a clutch of eggs, or a piglet, set aside not for the peasant's family, but for the altar. Beyond the tithe, peasants were expected to contribute to festivals, candles, and repairs for the village church, ensuring that God's house stood firm, even if their own cottages crumbled. There were also obligations known as banalities, fees paid to use the Lord's mill, oven, or winepress. A peasant could not simply grind his own grain at home. He was required to bring it to the Lord's mill, paying with a portion of the flour. Nor could he bake his bread without paying for the use of the communal oven. These banal dues reinforced the Lord's control over every aspect of production and reminded peasants daily of their dependence. On top of these steady obligations came extraordinary demands. If a lord needed funds for a military campaign, a ransom, or the dowry of a daughter, he could levy additional taxes on his tenants. These were deeply resented, but rarely refused. Refusal meant fines, punishment, or even eviction from the land that sustained them. The weight of these obligations made survival precarious. A poor harvest could spell disaster, for the dues were owed whether or not the crops thrived. Many peasants found themselves spiraling into debt, borrowing seed or tools from wealthier neighbors, only to sink further under the pressure of repayment. It was a cycle from which escape was almost impossible. And yet, these structures were not merely chains, they were also the glue that held medieval society together. The Lord's manor relied on peasant labor, and the church relied on peasant contributions. In return, peasants received at least a degree of protection. The Lord defended them from raiders, settled disputes, and maintained order, while the church promised salvation for their souls. To the medieval mind, these duties were less exploitation than part of the divine order. God had appointed each person to a station in life, lord, priest, or peasant, and each role was bound to the others. Still, cracks in this system were visible. In times of famine or heavy taxation, resentment brewed. Whispers of unfairness spread in taverns or fields. Some peasants began to dream of a life beyond these obligations, perhaps in a town, perhaps on unclaimed land, perhaps even in revolt. Every manor carried not only fields and cottages, but also its own court of justice, known as the manorial court, or court baron. It was here that peasants were reminded time and again of their place in society, presided over by the Lord himself, or, more often, his steward. These gatherings regulated nearly every aspect of village life. Attendance at the court was not optional. Peasants were expected to gather at fixed times of year, often several times annually, sitting on wooden benches in a barn, hall, or even out in the open air. The steward called each case in turn, and the villagers themselves, acting as a kind of jury, gave verdicts under his guidance. Justice, in other words, was communal, but always under the Lord's shadow. The offenses brought before the court were rarely dramatic crimes. Instead, they reflected the fabric of daily life. A man accused of letting his pigs trample a neighbor's field. A woman who sold ale without the Lord's license. A tenant who failed to maintain the boundary hedge. These were the sorts of disputes that filled the records. Each breach of custom or neglect of duty was met with a fine, large or small, adding to the Lord's coffers. More serious crimes, such as theft or violence, might still fall under the manor's jurisdiction, though in extreme cases they were passed on to the royal courts. A peasant caught stealing could expect a whipping, branding, or the stock's public humiliation designed to shame the offender into obedience. Gossip and insults were also taken seriously, for words could disrupt the fragile harmony of a village. Even quarrels between neighbors might end in court, with the guilty party ordered to pay compensation in grain, chickens, or coin. The system of justice was designed less to reform wrongdoers than to preserve order. It reminded peasants constantly of their obligations, not just to the Lord, but to each other, by fining those who shirked their duties or overstepped their rights. The court reinforced the delicate balance of shared survival. The church ran its own courts as well, concerned with spiritual and moral offenses. An accusation of adultery, usury, or failing to pay tithes might bring a villager before the ecclesiastical judge. Punishments here were rarely physical but often humiliating. Public penance, pilgrimages, or standing barefoot in the churchyard with a candle in hand. Salvation of the soul was at stake, and the church was eager to remind peasants that earthly missteps could have eternal consequences. For the peasant, these overlapping systems of justice, manorial, royal, and ecclesiastical, created a world of constant oversight. At nearly every turn, their lives were watched, judged, and recorded. And yet, within this structure, villagers sometimes found ways to protect their own. Local juries often sided with neighbors, downplaying offenses or agreeing to lighter fines. Justice was not blind but rooted in relationships, favors, and the intricate bonds of village life. Despite the sternness of these courts, violence in punishment was less common than one might imagine. Stocks, pillories, and fines were favored over executions. A peasant who could still work and provide labor was more valuable alive than dead. Harsh penalties were reserved for repeat offenders or those who truly threatened the Lord's authority. The presence of the court, then, was both a burden and a reassurance. It bound the community to its Lord but also offered a place to air grievances, settle disputes, and maintain order. In this way, law in the medieval village was both oppressive and essential, a constant reminder of the rules that kept the fragile system intact. Though peasants lived under strict obligations, they were not always silent or passive. Resistance took many forms, ranging from the quiet, everyday choices of survival to open revolt that shook entire kingdoms. Most acts of defiance were small and often invisible in the historical record. A man might work a little less diligently on the Lord's domain while reserving his strength for his own strip of land. A woman brewing ale might secretly sell it without a license, keeping the profits hidden from the manor court. Families sometimes concealed part of their harvest, hiding grain in cellars or beneath floorboards to reduce the Lord's share. These acts were risky, but they reflected the peasants' determination to carve out a measure of autonomy in a world of constant demands. There was also a culture of collective resistance. Villagers might band together to bend the rules, agreeing not to report one another's minor infractions at the manor court. If a neighbor's cow grazed illegally, or if firewood was taken from the Lord's forest, the community sometimes closed ranks, protecting its own against fines. Silence, in this sense, became an act of solidarity, but occasionally, discontent boiled over into open rebellion. The most famous of these in England was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of men and women rose up against oppressive taxes and harsh laws, sparked in part by the poll tax, a flat-rate tax that fell heavily on the poor peasants, marched from Kent and Essex toward London, demanding justice. They called for the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of rents, and a more equal order in London. Rebels entered the city, burning tax records and storming the houses of officials. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the world had been turned upside down, peasants standing face to face with kings and bishops. The young King Richard II met with the rebels, promising reforms, but the revolt was brutally crushed soon after. Its leaders, including Wat Tyler, were killed, and the promises were withdrawn. Yet the uprising left a mark, proving that peasants could, under extreme pressure, challenge the structures that bound them. Other regions across Europe witnessed their own revolts. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 saw peasants rise against noble lords in response to war and famine. In the German-speaking lands, later centuries would bring waves of rural uprisings demanding freedom and lower dues. Though most ended in bloodshed, they revealed the simmering discontent that always lurked beneath the surface of medieval order. Even short of rebellion, the fear of unrest influenced how lords ruled. Wise lords tempered their demands, recognizing that excessive taxes or cruelty could provoke dangerous backlash. Some introduced charters granting peasants more rights, allowing them to purchase freedom or negotiate rents in cash instead of labor. These concessions, though limited, reflected the delicate balance between authority and dependence. For most peasants, rebellion was less about overturning society than about securing fairness within it. They did not seek to abolish lords, castles, or kings. Rather, they wanted relief from crushing obligations, protection of customary rights, and dignity in their labor. Their struggles, whether through hidden acts of resistance or dramatic uprisings, remind us that the medieval countryside was never entirely silent. Beneath the rhythm of plowing, sowing, and harvesting beat the pulse of human determination, a desire for justice, freedom, and survival, beyond the obligations of rent and corvée. Peasants were also bound by a set of customary duties that reached into almost every corner of their lives. Many were required to use the Lord's mill to grind their grain, the Lord's oven to bake their bread, or the Lord's press to make their wine or cider. This was not a matter of choice. Attempting to build a private mill or oven could result in heavy fines, for the Lord claimed the right to profit from these essential services. While peasants may have grumbled about the expense, these monopolies ensured that the manor remained economically centered around the Lord's estate. Tied into this web of obligation was the concept of justice. Lords were not only landowners, but also judges. Manor courts convened several times a year, with peasants summoned to resolve disputes ranging from boundary disagreements to accusations of theft. The justice administered was not always impartial after all. The Lord benefited from fines collected, but it provided a semblance of order. In a world where no central authority was strong enough to enforce laws across wide territories, attendance at the manorial court was itself a duty. Even peasants not directly involved in cases could be called as jurors, witnesses, or part of the audience expected to uphold community order. Another dimension of peasant life within the feudal hierarchy was religion, deeply intertwined with social obligations. The church owned vast tracts of land, often functioning as a lord in its own right. Bishops and abbots held serfs and exacted rents, just as secular lords did. On top of their worldly dues, peasants were expected to pay tithes, usually 1/10 of their produce, to the local parish. This obligation weighed heavily on small households. Yet the church offered spiritual comfort, rituals marking the stages of life, and holy days that punctuated the grinding cycle of agricultural labor. For peasants, the calendar of saints' days and festivals was as much about rest as it was about devotion. Peasants' dependence on their lords was mirrored by the lords' dependence on them. Without their labor, fields would lie fallow, harvests would not be gathered, and rents would not flow. In times of famine or plague, when peasant numbers dwindled, lords often had to reduce demands or offer incentives to attract settlers to their lands. This precarious balance reveals the mutual, if unequal, reliance at the heart of feudalism. The lord needed the peasant, just as the peasant, however grudgingly, needed the lord's protection from raiders, bandits, or rival lords. The system, rigid as it might seem, was not without spaces for negotiation. Custom varied from manor to manor, and some peasants could argue their case based on precedent. A widow, for example, might petition the lord's court for the right to remain on her late husband's land, rather than being forced to remarry. In other cases, peasants could collectively resist increases in dues, subtly shaping the terms of their existence within the feudal order. As you picture this world, imagine yourself as a peasant summoned to the manorial court, clutching a small bundle of grain as payment for rent, or perhaps standing nervously as the steward records your obligations in a heavy leather-bound roll. These daily negotiations, though often lopsided, defined the peasant's position under the feudal hierarchy, secure enough to endure, yet always vulnerable to the demands of those above. In reflecting on the peasant's position under the lord, we see not merely a tale of subjugation, but a rhythm of mutual dependency. The manor, with its courts, dues, and obligations, was a world of rules and customs that bound everyone together in a fragile balance. The peasant owed labor and rent, yet the lord, too, owed protection and order. Neither could truly exist without the other, and though the hierarchy was steep and the burdens heavy, it created a framework that gave structure to daily life in an age where chaos and violence were never far away. Still, behind this rigid system, there was the quiet heartbeat of ordinary existence, the families who rose at dawn, the children who worked the fields beside their parents, the elders who recalled years of famine or abundance. It is here, in the humble routines of the household, that survival was tested most deeply, for no matter what rents were demanded or judgments passed down, the peasant family still had to find enough to eat, to keep warm through winter, and to pass their lives within the narrow margins allowed to them. And so, as we leave behind the towering figure of the lord and his manor court, let us step instead into the world of the cottage hearth. Section 3 will bring us closer into the peasant's home itself, into the daily rhythms of food, family, and survival. We will see what it truly meant to live as a peasant in medieval Europe, not in the records of lords or priests, but in the small, enduring details of ordinary life. Imagine pushing open the rough wooden door of a medieval peasant's cottage. At once, the air feels heavy, filled with the faint aroma of smoke from the hearth, mixed with the earthy scent of damp straw and the musty closeness of walls plastered with mud. Light seeps in faintly through small slits or shutters, but it is dim, and shadows stretch across the low rafters overhead. Most cottages were 1 or 2 rooms at most, their simplicity reflecting the narrow means of their inhabitants. At the heart of this space was the hearth, an open fire set in the center of the floor, or sometimes along one wall. Depending on local custom, there was no chimney as we think of it today. Instead, smoke lingered in the rafters, slowly seeping out through a hole in the roof, or through the cracks in the thatch. Families often grew accustomed to living in this smoky haze, their eyes watering and their lungs adapting to the constant fumes. Yet the fire was life itself. It gave heat in the bitter months. It cooked what little food could be spared, and it was the place where the family gathered when darkness came early. Around the fire, you would see only the barest furnishings, a rough table, perhaps a bench or two, and straw-stuffed mattresses rolled against the wall. The floor was not stone or wood, but packed earth, often damp in winter and dusty in summer. In wealthier peasant homes, rushes might be spread across the floor, sometimes sprinkled with herbs like lavender or mint, to mask unpleasant smells. These details tell us much. Comfort was scarce, but there was always some effort to soften the harshness of living conditions. The family itself often lived close together, parents, children, and sometimes elderly grandparents under the same roof. Privacy, as we know it today, was nearly non-existent. A curtain might be hung to divide sleeping areas, but more often, family members simply shared space, their lives woven together in daily intimacy. Infants slept swaddled beside their mothers, while older children often piled together on shared bedding, warmed by the nearness of their siblings. Animals, too, were sometimes brought indoors. A prized cow, a few sheep, or chickens might occupy one corner of the cottage, especially in the colder months. Their presence added warmth, though it also meant noise, smells, and the constant threat of fleas and lice. Yet, to the medieval peasant, these creatures were not mere companions, but essential sources of milk, eggs, wool, or meat. Protecting them within the family dwelling was a matter of survival. Meals were taken simply. A pot of pottage, a thick stew made from grains, peas, or beans, sometimes with scraps of meat or vegetables, might bubble over the fire throughout the day. Bread, coarse and dark from rye or barley, was the staple. Ale, weak and home-brewed, served as the common drink, safer than water that could easily be fouled. Eating together was less about ceremony and more about necessity, sharing whatever could be stretched among many mouths. In the evenings, after the day's labor in the fields, the family might gather around the hearth to mend clothing, repair tools, or simply talk in low voices while the fire flickered. Children listened to the murmured stories of elders' tales of saints, of local legends, or of distant times of famine and plenty. These stories carried memory and meaning, weaving identity in a world where written words were rare. The cottage then was more than shelter. It was the center of a peasant's universe, where hardship and warmth mingled, where survival depended on closeness, and where family bonds were lived out in the simplest daily tasks. To step inside is to glimpse not grandeur, but the persistence of ordinary life lived with resilience against the backdrop of a demanding age. Within the peasant household, every person had a place, and every set of hands, no matter how small, mattered in the delicate balance of survival. Unlike our modern notions of childhood, leisure, or clearly divided responsibilities, the medieval peasant family blurred these lines. The household was a living unit of labor, bound by necessity and tradition. The peasant father was, in theory, head of the family, though his authority was shaped less by grandeur and more by sheer responsibility. His primary task was to provide through labor, whether by working the fields, tending animals, or fulfilling obligations to the local lord. During harvest, he might spend dawn until dusk in the manorial fields, leaving little time at home. Yet when he returned, he was not idle. Repairs to tools, thatching of the roof, cutting wood for the hearth-all were tasks expected of him. His presence also gave the family a kind of stability, even if his word was not always final in the daily running of the cottage. The wife of a peasant carried perhaps the heaviest burden of all. She was the quiet manager of the household, ensuring that food stretched, that clothing remained patched, and that children were fed and disciplined. She rose as early as her husband, if not earlier, to stoke the hearth, prepare pottage, and begin spinning or weaving if wool or flax was at hand. Her role blended domestic care with economic necessity. Many women worked in the fields, beside their husbands during planting and harvest, their hands blistered by tools, yet still expected to return home and see to supper. In her, the household found its heartbeat. She kept the fire alive, both literally and figuratively. Children were not seen as dependents in the modern sense. From a young age, they became workers in training, their chores scaling with their size. Small children might carry water, collect eggs, or help herd geese. By the age of 7 or 8, A boy could already be helping in the fields, guiding oxen, or sowing seed under his father's watch. Girls often shadowed their mothers, learning to spin, cook, and tend to siblings. Childhood was brief. Survival demanded it. Yet there was room for play, rolling hoops, tossing stones, or chasing each other through the fields. These games, however, were always interwoven with the rhythms of labor, as free time was never abundant. Grandparents, if they lived long enough to see their grandchildren grow, often played a vital if quieter role. They might tend the hearth while the others worked, or tell stories to children while mending simple tools. Though age often brought frailty, it also carried authority. Elders held memory knowledge of planting cycles, weather patterns, and village customs that could guide younger generations. In this way, the peasant household was not a place where one person bore the weight alone. Instead, it was a web of interdependence, each member bound to the next. To remove one thread was to weaken the whole. Men, women, and children might toil in different tasks, but they shared the same bread, the same roof, and the same struggles. Though the cottage was the center of peasant life, no family survived in isolation. A medieval peasant's existence was woven into the fabric of the village, where bonds of cooperation and obligation often meant the difference between hunger and survival. Neighbors lived close, their cottages clustered along narrow tracks or grouped around a central green. These households shared tools, advice, and even labor when tasks grew too large for one family. Harvest time, especially, became a collective effort, with neighbors working side by side to bring in crops before the weather turned. This was not simply kindness, it was necessity. To fail in reaping one's grain in time might mean losing food for the year. And so villagers leaned on one another when hands were short. The rhythm of village life was punctuated by communal gatherings. The church was the focal point, not only for worship, but for social interaction. On Sundays, the entire village came together, dressed in their cleanest tunics and hoods, to hear Mass. The service, though in Latin and largely incomprehensible to many, provided spiritual reassurance. More tangibly, it gave peasants the chance to exchange news, arrange marriages, or discuss matters with neighbors. Festivals, too, brought rare brightness to otherwise monotonous lives. The great feasts of the church calendar, Christmas, Easter, and the feast days of saints were marked by processions, music, and often a respite from labor. May Day, with its dancing and greenery, celebrated fertility and the renewal of life, while harvest festivals expressed gratitude for a successful yield. These occasions allowed peasants to forget hardship for a moment, to sing, drink, and laugh in the company of their fellows. Marriage itself was a communal affair, often arranged within the village or with neighboring communities. Weddings were simple but joyful, marked by the blessing of the priest and followed by feasting, dancing, and merriment as much as resources allowed. Births, too, were shared experiences. Women of the village gathered to assist in childbirth, offering support and knowledge passed down over generations. Baptisms soon followed, binding the child not only to the faith, but to the larger community. For godparents were chosen carefully as allies and supporters of the family. At the same time, village life could be marked by tension. Disputes over boundaries, grazing rights, or water access sometimes flared, requiring mediation by the Lord's steward or by local custom. Gossip traveled quickly, and reputations could rise or fall with surprising speed. Still, these frictions did not erase the underlying truth. Peasants relied on one another, bound not just by necessity, but by the shared understanding of what it meant to endure life's challenges together. Thus, beyond the walls of the peasant cottage stretched a wider network, a living web of labor, ritual, and companionship that gave meaning to otherwise harsh and fragile lives. Marriage for peasants was rarely a matter of romantic choice. More often, it was a negotiation of survival, family alliances, and practical arrangements. A father might discuss the future of his son with a neighboring household, ensuring that land, tools, or animals could be shared or strengthened through marriage ties. For daughters, the question was not wealth, but security, finding a husband who could provide, however modestly, and who belonged within the same parish community. Still, affection could grow from these unions, as shared hardship often knit couples together in ways that modern comforts might never replicate. Weddings, while lacking the grandeur of noble ceremonies, were deeply meaningful to villagers. After the blessing of the priest, couples were often married at the church door, a symbolic threshold between the sacred and the worldly. The community participated fully, celebrating with song, simple feasts, and games. For many peasants, this day was one of the rare moments of unrestrained joy in their otherwise constrained lives. Childbirth followed quickly in most marriages, with little knowledge of contraception and the church discouraging practices that limited fertility. Families were often large, yet childbirth was perilous for both mother and child. Midwives, women with experience and inherited knowledge, played a central role. They relied on herbs, prayers, and practical techniques passed down over generations. Still, infant mortality was high, and many women bore the scars, physical and emotional, of repeated pregnancies. Survival of both mother and infant was never guaranteed, and each successful birth was both a relief and a cause for communal celebration. Children who survived infancy became integral to family life. Baptism came soon after birth, welcoming the child into both the Christian faith and the village community. Godparents, carefully chosen, served as spiritual and social supporters, forming bonds that could aid the family in times of need. Childhood, however, was brief. By the age of 7, a child was expected to take up chores and gradually assume the responsibilities of adulthood. Death was never far from the peasant's world. Life expectancy was short, and disease, poor harvests, or accidents could quickly cut a life short. Funerals were somber, but communal events, marked by prayers for the soul and the presence of neighbors who shared the burden of grief. The dead were laid to rest in the churchyard, close to the sacred ground where Mass was celebrated. In this way, the rhythms of life, birth, work, marriage, death were tied inseparably to the church, which framed the journey of every peasant from cradle to grave. In the cottage, these life passages left their mark. A marriage meant new ties, a birth brought both joy and strain, and a death rearranged the fragile balance of survival. Yet through it all, the family carried on, their lives bound to the soil, the seasons, and each other in ways that were as unyielding as they were enduring. And so, as the fire in our imagined cottage slowly fades to embers, we leave behind the humble rhythms of peasant life in medieval Europe. We have walked with them through their fields, stepped into their smoky cottages, shared in their meals, their marriages, and their burdens, and felt the closeness of families and communities bound by survival. Perhaps, as you drift now into rest, you carry with you the quiet strength of those who lived so simply, whose days were shaped by the rising sun, the turning of the seasons, and the enduring bonds of family. Their world was harsh, yet within it beat the timeless heart of humanity: resilience, hope, and care for one another. As your eyes grow heavy, let the slow rhythm of their lives lull you into calm. You do not need to picture the toil or the hardship anymore, only the gentle crackle of the hearth, the low murmur of voices in the dark, and the peace of a village long asleep beneath the stars. And when you next return, we'll step into another story, one even more fascinating, and, perhaps, even more sleep-inducing. A quiet journey into the past that will carry you deeper into rest, and deeper into history. So for now, let yourself drift, and I'll meet you again in the next tale.